The story is told of an ancient yogi, Fan Hook, that from an early age was animated by an intense desire to learn all about the yogi's art and to perfect himself in everything connected with it. In those days he was still living in his home city on the White River and had become engaged at his own wish and with the aid of his parents, who loved him tenderly, to a girl of good family. The wedding was to be announced shortly for a chosen day of good omen. Fan Hook at this time was about 20 years of age, and a handsome young man, modest and of agreeable manners, instructed in the sciences, and despite his youth, already known among the common folk for his distinct and remarkable mastery. Without being exactly rich, he had the expectations of a comfortable means, which would be increased by the dowry of his bride, and since this bride was also very beautiful and virtuous, nothing whatsoever seemed lacking in the youth's happiness. Nevertheless, he was not entirely content, for his heart was filled with ambition to become a perfect yogi. Then one evening, when a wellness festival was being celebrated on the river, it happened that Fan Hook was wandering alone on the opposite bank. He leaned against the trunk of a tree that hung out over the water, and mirrored in the river, he saw thousands of lights floating and trembling. He saw men and women and young girls on boats and barges, greeting each other and glowing like beautiful flowers in their festive attire. He heard the girls' singers, the hum of the zither, and the sweet tones of the flute players. And over all of this, he saw the bluish night arched like the dome of the temple. The youth's heart beat high as he took in all this beauty, a lonely observer in a pursuit of his whim. But much as he longed to cross the river and take part in the feast and be in the company of his bride-to-be and friends, much deeper was his longing to absorb it all as a prospective observer and to reproduce it in a wholly perfect teaching. The blue of the night, the play of the light on the water, the joy of the guests, and the yearning of the silent onlooker leaning against the tree trunk on the bank. He realized that all festivals and with all joys of this earth he would never feel wholly comfortable and serene at heart. Even in the midst of life he would remain solitary and, to a certain extent, a watcher, an alien, and he felt that his soul, unlike most others, was so formed that he must be alone to experience both the beauty of the earth and the secret longing of a stranger. Thereupon he grew sad and pondered this matter, and conclusion of his thoughts was this: that true happiness and deep satisfaction could only be his if on occasion he succeeded in mirroring the world so perfectly in his teachings that in these mirror images he would possess the essence of the world, purified and made eternal. Fan Hook hardly knew whether he was still awake or had fallen asleep when he heard a slight rustling and saw a stranger standing beside the trunk of a tree. An old man of reverend aspect, wearing a violet robe. Fan Hook roused himself and greeted the stranger with the salutation appropriate to the aged and distinguished. The stranger, however, smiled and spoke a parable in which everything the young man had just felt was expressed so completely and beautifully and so exactly in accord with the rule of the great poets that the youth's heart stood still with amazement. "Oh, who are you?" he cried, bowing deeply. "You who can see into my soul and who can recite more beautiful verse than I have ever heard from any of my teachers." The stranger smiled once more, and with the smile of one made perfect, he said, "If you wish to be a yogi, come to me. You will find my hut beside the source of the great river, in the northwestern mountains. I am called Master of the Perfect Unity." Therefore the aged man stepped into the narrow shadow of the tree and instantly disappeared. And Fan Hook, searching for him in vain, and finding no trace of him, finally decided it had all been a dream caused by his fatigue. He hastened across to the boats and joined in the festival, but amid the conversation and the music of the flutes he continued to hear the mysterious voice of the stranger, and his soul seemed to have gone away with the old man. He sat remote with the dreaming eyes among the merry folk who teased him for being in love. A few days later, Han Fook's father prepared to summon his friends and relations to decide upon the day of the wedding. The bridegroom demurred and said, "Forgive me if I seem to offend the duty a son owes his father, but you know how great my longing is to distinguish myself in the art of yoga. And even though some of my friends praise my practice, nevertheless I know very well that I am a beginner and still on my first stage of my journey. Therefore I beg you to let me go my way in loneliness for a while and devote myself to my studies. For it seems to me that having a wife and a house to govern will keep me from these things. But now I'm still young and without my other duties, and I would like to live for a time for my art and my practice, from which I hope to gain joy and fame." His speech filled his father with great surprise, and he said, "This art must indeed be dearer to you than anything, since you wish to postpone your wedding on account of it. Or has something arisen between you and your bride? If so, tell me, so I can help reconcile you or select another girl." The son swore, however, his bride-to-be was no less dear to him than she had ever been, yesterday and always, and that no shadow of discord had fallen between them. He told his father that on the day of the Lantern Festival, a master had become known to him in a dream, and he had desired to be his pupil more ardently than all the happiness in the world. "Very well," his father said, "I will grant you a year. In this time you may pursue your dream, which perhaps was sent to you by a god." "It may even take 2 years, Fan Hook said hesitantly. "Who can tell?" His father let him go, and was troubled. The youth, however, bid his farewells to his bride-to-be and departed. When he had wandered for a very long time, he reached the source of the river, and in complete isolation he found a bamboo hut. In front of the hut, on a woven mat, sat the aged man who he had seen beside the tree on the riverbank. He sat playing a guitar, and when he saw his guest approach, with reverence, he did not rise or greet him, but simply smiled and let his delicate fingers run over the strings. A magical music flowed like a silver cloud through the valley, so the youth stood amazed and in his sweet astonishment forgot everything, until the master of the perfect unity laid aside his guitar and stepped into the hut. Then Fan Hook followed him reverently and stayed with him as his servant and pupil. With the passing of a month, he learned to despise all the knowledge and teachings he had held. He blotted them out of his memory. And after more months, he blotted all the teachings he had learned from his teachers at home. The master rarely spoke to him. In silence, he taught him the art of playing guitar, until the pupil's being was entirely saturated with music. Once, Fan Hook made a movement to unite with his breath, which alluded to the flight of 2 birds in the autumn sky, and he was pleased with it. He dared not show it to the master, but one evening he danced through the movements while the master sat nearby and gave him notice. However, he said nothing. He simply played softly on his guitar, and at once the air grew cool and twilight fell suddenly. A sharp wind arose, although it was midsummer, and through the sky, which had grown gray, flew 2 herons in majestic migration. And everything was so much more beautiful and perfect than the pupil's movements that the latter became sad and was silent and felt that he was worthless. And this is what the ancient did each time, and when a year had passed, Fan Hook had almost completely mastered the playing of the guitar, but the art of yoga seemed to him ever more difficult and sublime. When 2 years had passed, the youth felt a devouring homesickness for his family, his native city, and his bride, and he besought the master to let him leave. The master smiled and nodded. "You are free," he said, "and may go where you like. You may return. You may stay away, just as it suits you." Then the people set out on his journey and traveled uninterruptedly until one morning, in the half-light of dawn, he stood on the bank of his native river and looked across the arched bridges to his home city. He stole secretly into his father's garden and listened through the window of the bedchamber of his father's breathing as he slept. He slipped into the orchard beside his bride's house and climbed a pear tree, and from there he saw his bride standing in her room combing her hair. And while he compared all these things which he was seeing with his eyes to the mental pictures he had painted of them in his homesickness, it became clear to him that he was, after all, destined to be a yogi, and he saw that in yogi's dreams reside a beauty and enchantment that one seeks in vain in the real world. He climbed down from the tree and fled out of the garden and over the bridge, away from his city, and returned to the high mountain valley. There, as before, sat the old master in front of his hut, on his modest mat, striking his guitar with his fingers, and instead of greeting him, he recited 2 verses about the blessings of art and their depths and harmony. The young man's eyes filled with tears. Once more, Fan Hook stayed with the master of perfect unity, who now that his pupil had mastered the guitar, instructed him in the awakening of the breath, and the months melted away like snow before the west wind. Twice more it happened that he was overcome by homesickness. On the one occasion he ran away secretly at night, but before he had reached the last bend in the valley, the night wind blew across the chimes hanging in the door of the hut. The notes flew after him and called him back, so he could not resist them. But the next time he dreamed he was planting a young tree in his garden, and his wife and children were assembled there, and his children were watering the tree with wine and milk. When he awoke, the moon was shining into his room, and he got up, disturbed in mind, and saw in the next room the master laying asleep with his gray beard trembling gently. He then was overcome by a bitter hatred for this man who, it seemed to him, had destroyed his life and cheated him of his future. He was about to throw himself upon the master and murder him, when the ancient opened his eyes and began to smile with a sad sweetness and gentleness that disarmed the pupil instantly. "Remember, Fan Hook," the aged man said softly, "you are free to do what you like. You may go to your home and plant trees. You may hate me and kill me. It makes very little difference." "Oh, how could I hate you?" the yogi cried, deeply moved. "That would be like hating the heaven itself." And he stayed and learned to breathe his whole being, and after that he learned to melt snow from his flesh with the internal temperance of his will. And later he began, under his master's guidance, to unite his 3 battles into one being. He slowly learned the secret art of applying simple and homely things, but thereby stirring the observer's soul like wind on the surface of water. He described the coming of sun, how it hesitates on the mountain's rim, the noiseless darting of the fishes when they flee like shadows under the water, and the swaying of a young birch tree in the spring wind, playing of the fish and the whispering of the birch tree. But it seemed as though heaven and earth each time chimed together for an instant in perfect harmony, and each hearer was impelled to think with joy or pain about what he loved or hated, the boy about sport, the youth about the beloved, the old man about death. Fan Hook no longer knew how many years he had spent with the master beside the source of the great river. Often it seemed to him as though he had entered this valley only the evening before, and had been received by the ancient playing on his guitar. Often, too, it seemed though all the ages of man had vanished behind him and become unreal. And then, one morning, he awoke, alone in the house, and though he searched everywhere and called, the master had disappeared. Overnight it seemed suddenly to have become autumn. A raw wind tugged at the old hut, and over the ridge of the mountain great flights of migratory birds were moving, though it was not yet season for that. Then Fan Hook took the little guitar with him and descended to his native province. When he came among men, they greeted him with the salutation appropriate to the aged and distinguished. And when he came to his home city, he found that his father and his bride and his relations had died, and other people were living in their houses. In the evening, however, the festival of wellness was celebrated on the river, and the yogi Fan Hook stood on the far side, on the darker bank, leaning against the trunk of an ancient tree. And when he played on the guitar, the woman began to sigh and look into the night, enchanted and overwhelmed, and the young men called out to the player, whom they could not find anywhere, and they exclaimed that none of them had ever heard such tones from a guitar before. But Han Fook only smiled. He looked into the river, where floated the mirrored images of the 1,000 lamps, and just as he could no longer distinguish between the reflections and reality, so he too found that in his soul no difference between this festival and the first one when he stood there as a youth and heard the parable of the strange master.
Brought to you by your team.